It is time for a Thursday review. And while you all may have seen me tweeting about this article over the holiday break, I figured this would be a good place to start. So buckle up, it's Thursday review night. Okay, so you all probably saw me tweeting about this if you follow me on Twitter. This particular article caught my attention courtesy of another Twitter user who had posted this, and then I started reading it, and then I couldn't sleep because it bothered me so much. And so I just kept right on going with it. And so it's an article called Intersectional Inequalities in Science. And you're going to notice I have in science up here highlighted, and I have it highlighted for a very good reason. We're going to get into that in a minute. But don't forget, folks, this is Thursday review day. This will be hopefully a regular thing going forward, 7 p.m. Central Time, premiering on YouTube. And of course, comment in the live chat and tell me what you think as we're going along here. And if you're a local supporter, don't forget at 8 p.m. Central Time is the local supporters exclusive live chat. And again, that is only for supporters on locals on Thursday evenings. So I hope you will join us for that. It should be a blast of a time if you can join us. So intersectional inequalities in science. Let us read first the abstract, and then I'm going to take you through things that are important. And I like this particular article in terms of reviewing it for things in here because it makes me think very much of things that were really done on a very narrow subset, and not done very well for that matter, done on a narrow subset that were then also, shall we say, overgeneralized. They say in science with this article. The opening here says intersectional inequalities in science. And so you would think they were talking about all of the many scientific disciplines that there are. Think in your head really quickly here about the tremendous number of scientific disciplines and subdisciplines that exist. Social sciences, physical sciences, you can go down the chain of physical sciences with chemistry, biology, hydrology, meteorology, climatology, physics, all those kinds of things, statistics in there. Engineering shows up regularly. Though it's not technically a science, there is a decent amount of research done in engineering. At least I think it's not technically a science. That's a good question. Anyway, but you get the point. There's a tremendous number of scientific disciplines and subdisciplines here. And somebody would read this. Typically, if you're just reading an article and you just want the gist of it, you'd read the introduction and you'd read the conclusions, but you wouldn't read anything in the middle. And I encourage you to actually read the middle and to actually read the methods of a study. And the reason I suggest you read the methods of a study quite clearly is because it can tell you whether or not the conclusions are justified from the study. Which, broadly speaking, I will tell you up front with this particular paper, I do not think so. I do not think this study is justified at all in its conclusions. Let us read the abstract first, and then I will show you a few things about this particular article that would be of interest. The U.S. scientific workforce is primarily composed of white men. Studies have demonstrated that systemic barriers preventing women and other minoritized populations from gaining entry to science. Few, however, have taken an intersectional perspective and examined the consequences of these inequalities of scientific knowledge. We provide a large-scale bibliometric analysis of the relationship between intersectional identities, topics, and scientific impact. We find homophily between identities and topics, suggesting a relationship between diversity in the scientific workforce and the expansion of the knowledge base. However, topic selection comes at a cost to minoritized individuals for whom we both observe both between and within topic citation disadvantages. To enhance the robustness of science, research organizations should provide adequate resources to historically underfunded research areas while simultaneously providing access for minoritized individuals to high-prestige networks and topics. So, that's the abstract. And again, you would think this is about science. And when they're talking about bibliometric analysis, what they did was gather together as many different articles as they possibly could to do an analysis on those articles, topics associated with them, and connected that, in this case, with race and gender in here. See, so topic number 1 here. Strong disparities observed in the composition of the scientific workforce. At the global level, women account for less than a third of scientists and engineers, a percentage that is similar to their proportion of scientific authorships. In the United States, women represent 28.4% of the scientific workforce, and this percentage varies by domain, with a high of 72.8% in psychology and a low of 14.5% in engineering. Disparities are also observed at the intersection of race and gender, with white men comprising a disproportionate amount of the U.S. workforce. Notice no numbers there, but anyway, although the trend is changing, faculty of color increased from 20% of the scientific workforce in 2005 to 25% in 2018. Increases have not been observed equally across all racially minoritized groups. For instance, the proportion of Black, 5 to 6%, and American Indian, Alaska Native, 1% scholars remain relatively stable, while Latinx representation nearly doubled, 3.5 to 6%, and Asian representation increased from 9.1% to 11%. Gender differences are also observed within racial categories. Men account for a higher share than women, especially for white and Asian Pacific Islanders. Likewise, the presence of minoritized groups varies substantially by disciplines. Science, technology, engineering, computer science, mathematics disciplines exhibit far less demographic diversity than non-STEM fields. For example, in biology, only 0.7% of faculty identify as Black, despite representing 12.2% of the U.S. population. So I'm going to point out that this is cherry picking right here to pick one example here right off the front. But let's see. Disparities. Yeah. I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to disagree that the disparities exist. They do. The question is why, and I have not really seen it be convincingly argued why some of these disparities exist. In a lot of different. I'm not giving credence to one thing or the other. I just haven't seen a really great argument here for why certain disparities exist. So that's what I just want to point out. But again, I bring this paragraph up because I want to make a point about the article as a whole with this review that I think you want to keep in mind if you yourself are reading a study. A lot of people, and particularly a lot of scientists themselves, I've seen this and I've been guilty of it, which is why I encourage you not to do it, because I have done it before and been burned for doing it. A lot of scientists have just read the introduction and then read the conclusions. And the assumption at times is because it gets past peer review, it's perfect, it's great, it's amazing. That's not necessarily true all the time. This is a kind of a trust but verify kind of thing is what I tend to recommend now, is to make sure you go in. Does the method support the conclusions? Does the method and what they're doing here work with the framing of the article? They mention here a lot right up at the front, STEM. And again, I work in a STEM field on a regular basis myself. So there is that kind of importance. What I would point out here is that the question to ask when we get into this is, does the method support the framing at the end? And does the work done also, because the method informs the analysis done, which informs what conclusions can be, work with it at the end? So let's see. This is their significant statements. And where this appeared, I should tell you where this particular article appeared in 2021. It's a very recent publication, is the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, which is concerning given the quality. The U.S. scientific workforce is not representative of the population. Define representative. Barriers to entry and participation have been well studied. However, few have examined the effect these disparities on the advancement of science. You notice they're using disparities and the systemic discrimination thing interchangeably, which is a logical fallacy in and of itself, the disparity fallacy. Furthermore, most studies have looked at either race or gender, failing to account for the intersection of these variables. Our analysis utilizes millions of scientific papers to study the relationship between scientists and the science they produce. We find a strong relationship between the characteristics of the scientists and their research topics, suggesting that diversity changes the scientific portfolio with consequences for career advancement for minoritized individuals. That's just odd phrasing. Minoritized individuals. Something about that just rings weird. Science policy should consider this relationship to increase equitable precipitation in the scientific workforce and thereby improve the robustness of science. Again, the whole framing up here is this is about all of science. And particularly you see it about STEM here. And I'm going to point out to you that this is why I can't stand the conclusions here, because the conclusions are not warranted and this framing is not warranted. There's quite a lot of interesting framing going on with the narrative of this paper. And while the analysis may be good, it doesn't say anything about what causes some of the things you see. And I'm going to point this out again. I'm going to point this out for you. First off, I got to note something interesting here. This happens, as has happened to me, so this is not actually a dig on the authors. I've done this before too, but for the PNAS folks, you got to get a better copy editor. Funding, one of the main drivers of research activity, is similarly affected by researchers' social identifies and aligns with topic selection. I do believe that should read social identities. There should have been a copy editor to look at that, if not the actual editor. But again, this is a thing here. Anyway, let's see. Intersectionality was initially introduced as an analytic framework. It's not really analytic at all, from what I understand of it, for understanding how interrelated and mutually shaping categories of race and gender serve to compound inequalities. This is going to be something I want you to notice. I'm starting to see this more and more, where inequalities and inequities are being used interchangeably. Be very careful of that, because they do mean two different things, but there is an attempt to try to make them the same thing. These studies emphasize women's racialized and gendered experiences by explicitly situating minoritized women as central actors in power struggles and social inequalities. Again, this is about inequalities, pardon me, I have an itch, that they're saying here, and it really seems, the way it reads off, like inequalities and inequities are being used interchangeably when those two words do not mean the same thing. The intersectional framework has since been expanded and used to frame the marginalization experienced by minoritized groups at the intersection of race, gender, sexual orientation, class, and other identities. While gender inequities and inequalities, now you get them both, have been the focus of several recent large-scale analyses, very few studies have focused on racial and ethnic composition of the authors. Studies from an intersectional perspective have predominantly qualitative, based on self-reports or focused on a particular field or set of subfields. These studies provide rich evidence of the impact of structural biases on career trajectories through valuable storytelling and suggest a need for an intersectional lens to large-scale studies. In other words, a lot of intersectional studies are anecdotal. That is the point right there, that I get. Qualitative, and there's nothing wrong with qualitative research. That's not what I'm getting at. The self-reports or on a particular set of subfields, again, it's anecdotal. It doesn't necessarily provide an else. That's true of a lot of intersectional studies, is what they just basically said here. That's my interpretation of that, but that would be what I would get from that. And this is where I call a bit of BS. And again, I call them BS on what I said before, and I'm going to get into it even more in a second. This study extends investigations of gender disparities in science by providing a macro-level view of the phenomena that accounts for the intersection of race, gender, and topic. I'm going to show you something interesting, and here's a lesson I want to get. One of my earliest mentors in college, actually, when I was starting undergrad in 2004, I did a summer program before the fall semester started and was actually with a math professor. And he kept pushing the button when you would answer a question. Brilliant way to get at it. of why. Why is that? Why did you get that answer? Why did you get that? Why did you get that? Why does that work? Why does that go that way? And it sticks with me. You know why? Because there's a lot of analysis that's done that shows relationships and shows things that are real data and disparities, but doesn't show you at all why that relationship or disparity is there. And that's part of the reason I highlight this section, is to be thinking about that. Do the scientists doing a study show you why something is happening? Explain why something is happening in a manner that you can follow in the evidence. That if X, like with our hypothesis, if our hypothesis is correct, when we see this, we should also see this. That's what I mean by being able to connect it with the why. And the reason why our hypothesis works is the longer explanation. I'm noticing there's not a whole thing of why. The why that is assumed with this is because of systemic X, because of longstanding X, we have these things that happen with race, gender, and topic in this relationship that we see in the data. Because they talk very extensively up here about systemic discrimination and all these kinds of things, presuming that it is the reason why they see what they're going to see in the data. And we'll get to that in a second. This paper attempts to demonstrate that the election of the object of study is related to race and gender, with implications for scientific progress and evaluation of scientists. So the major thing that they are saying here, let me read the longer thing here real quick. Despite the acknowledged importance of race and gender as factors of inequality and decades-long policy interventions, there remains a paucity of evidence on how the selection of fields and topics is scattered across groups at a detailed level and the relation between topics and scientific impact. This paper attempts to demonstrate that the election of the object of study is related to race and gender, with implications for scientific progress in the evaluation of scientists. What they basically go on to say is that based upon the race of, my guess here from this is they go on to say that based upon the race and the gender of a person, they're more likely to select specific topics. And for whatever reason, I think they assume in here, because of systemic discrimination, people from different races and genders will select specific topics to do research on, and those topics that minoritized individuals end up picking for the reasons of their systemic discrimination claim here end up in topics that are less cited and have less impact on the scientific discipline. That is their argument. I'm going to point out that this I find implausible in some ways, because of the breadth of scientific disciplines and subdisciplines that there are now. I find that somewhat implausible. I also have a question that occurred to me after the fact that I've been wanting to ask, that, it would be interesting to see the response to it from the authors if they actually looked at this. Let's see. So, methods, this is a couple of things I want to point out in here. The metadata. Okay, so we examined the publication patterns of U.S.-affiliated first authors between 2008 and 2019. Our data consists of 5,431,451 articles indexed in the Web of Science database and 1,609,107 distinct U.S. first authors. We focus on first authors as they are generally those who have contributed the most to an article and represent the most visible name in bibliographic references. The metadata includes authors' given and family names, which are used to infer race and gender. Now, why do I highlight this? Family names, given and family names, to infer race and gender in the United States, which is quite a melting pot of different ethnicities, cultures, races, if you will, from all around the world. And I was watching Sheena Mason interview on The Reason We Learn with Deb about the theory of racelessness, and Sheena argues that race doesn't really exist. It's the more so that we've been construing it with construing race and considering it as we should. Ethnicity and culture have been misconstrued as race is basically the theory of racelessness, which is an interesting kind of thing there. So that race isn't really real. Oh, that's an interesting thing there. I've been really thinking about it, so that just came out of my head for a second. Sorry. As we're thinking about it. But they are using given and family names to infer race and gender. What's the error on that? Because I'll give you an example. Tim Pool has talked about it on his channel that he, on one side of his family, is Korean. So if it were his name on the publication, would their metadata here would their method infer that he is part Korean, as an example? I want to know the error of that method, because I suspect it's pretty substantial. Okay, here's the other part of it that's important. Racial categories are country-dependent social construct. Not all countries have such categorizations. Therefore, our analysis focuses on the specific cultural construct of race found in the United States. For the inference of race, ethnic origin, we use the 2010 census information on family names and racial groups. Racial groups considered in the U.S. Census are the following: non-Hispanic white alone, white; non-Hispanic black or African alone, black; non-Hispanic Asian; Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander alone, Asian; non-Hispanic American Indian, Alaska Native alone, AIAN; non-Hispanic, two or more races, two or more, and Hispanic or Latino origin, Latinx. Just a reminder for the PNAS authors, I think it's 3% of Hispanic people even know what Latinx is, and not very many of them like it, according to polling. So I suggest you stop using it. Given that AIAN and two or more account for only 0.69% and 1.76% of WOS authors, respectively, they were removed from analysis. Census data provides the number of people that identify with each racial group for the 162,253 most common family names. Using family names, we compute each author's associated probability to each racial group instead of assigning the most probable group, and using these probabilities to compute weighted aggregates in which each author contributes to each group's aggregate as a function of the racial group distribution associated with the family name. This means, for example, that when computing the average citations by race, we assign the citations of an article fractionally to each group according to the corresponding distribution. In other words, we do not assign authors to a unique racial category, which is to say what they're doing essentially is based upon the census data and the distribution of names typically associated with a particular race according to what's in the census and the people who respond to the census. Which is, I've had family who work for the census before. Not all people respond to the census. Just a good point to make in there. They are assigning a probability that an author with a given name is from one particular race or another. That is what they're assigning in there. And so that's where it gets interesting, because they assign it by the probability, and I suggest fractionally assigning citations. So they're basically saying if someone is, for example, biracial, an author is biracial, half black and half white, for example, for lack of a better way to describe it, 50% of their citations would be assigned to the category of black. 50% of their citations would be assigned to the category of white. And so that is, in essence, accounting, in a way, for biracial folks here, which is an interesting way to get at. In other words, but what I have never seen with any of this is how well this actually works. Given what example that I just gave you. with the notion of Tim Pool, for example. Consider that. Now is the thing I want to talk about the most, though, in this, because, oh, that's something I didn't notice before. Wait a second. In previous work, we have shown that given the overlap of filtering those names with a probability for a single group above a threshold, deciding all authors underestimates the proportion of black authors. Well, that's good to know. At least listed that. I would give you some credit there. Again, I want to know the accuracy of your probability weighting kind of approach too, which is not in here. I would prefer to see it here, not in an appendix. Now, here's the thing. I want to note. Do you notice something interesting? For all of their discussion before about STEM and all of science, do you notice what they focus on? Given the sample size in social science and health and the interpretability of results across different experiments, we found that the optimal number of topics for our analysis to be 200 for health and 300 for social sciences. Almost everything in this paper, results and analysis, focuses on these two components of science, not on STEM. They don't focus anything on STEM in reality. This is why you read the methods, because this right here is exactly why I don't think the conclusions of this article are very valid. Always check the methods. This is my immediate advice to any of you who end up with a study in your lap and you're reading the study. Check the methods against the conclusions, the analysis, and, the abstract and what have you. Because having appropriate methods justifies your conclusions. This does not, because they make sweeping framing at the beginning about all of science, and you can see some of their conclusions summarized in the significant statement in the abstract and saying this is true of all of science. Well, no. You did your results in this study here on social sciences and health. Let's continue. Okay, this figure, I'm going to zoom in on this figure a little bit. Because this is the only figure where STEM fields are mentioned. Physics, mathematics, engineering, chemistry, earth, biomedical research, and then on up the way. Biology here too. And I want to notice something. So normalized citations, what here? Average number of normalized citations by group. So they really don't say much about how they normalize the citations, as I recall correctly, although I may have missed it. Fair point if I did. In here, how they normalize citations. So a question of mine did you do citations essentially per capita? In here, which I don't know. I can't tell with that. And all of these different things. I can't tell. Did citations get done per capita, which is distinctly possible in here. And, what I also notice is, let me see here. What is this? Overrepresentation, underrepresentation. On the vertical axis, fields are sorted in by the relative over and underrepresentation of Black women authors. So basically they're saying that in these cooler colors, that demographic group is underrepresented in that field, and in the red colors they are overrepresented. And I'm guessing, and this is my guess in the way it's represented, is this is based upon the based upon the number of things here. But you notice one thing that they don't do, which I didn't see it anywhere, really, with respect to STEM and what have you in particular, is they have citations by discipline right here involved. And you can see it's very much different for different journals. Arts. What the heck? Why is arts in there? Okay, that's something I didn't notice before. Sometimes you read it a second time and you find some interesting things. But you can also go and find things like this. Yes, you have normalized citations up here, which I don't remember exactly how they did that, although maybe I can find it real quick because I am curious at actually how they did that. How did they do it? Sorry, gonna go some live finding. Okay. Okay, scholarly impact is assessed through a field and year normalizing citations using an open citation window covering publication years through the end of 2019. For each article, we infer the first author's gender and distribution over racial categories as well as over topics. Oh, and by the way, gender is just male or female here. Each article then has a probability distribution over racial categories, a binary classification over gender, and a probability distribution over topics. Aggregate results are obtained using fractional counting over these three dimensions. For example, an article can have a first author whose name has a 0.7 racial classification probability of being a black author, a 0.3 of being a white author whose gender is inferred to be a woman. It also has an 0.8 probability on topic A, 0.1 probability on topic B, and so on. Therefore, this article contributes an additional 0.56 authors to group of black women in topic A, authors to group in black women in topic B, and so on across topics and racial groups for women. The weighted sum over these dimensions plus the citations gives us the aggregate number of the aggregate results of distributions over topics by race and gender and the average number of normalized citations per topic, race, and gender. Over and under representation are based on the overall proportion that each group represents across all articles combined. Okay. So that explains that. What the normalized citations thing is the weighted sum over the dimensions. Interesting. Okay. So the weighted sum gives the average number of citations. Interesting. I still would actually want to see this graphic broken down. This is the biggest critique I've had of this graphic, actually, is that you, up here, group everybody of this group together, of these groups together. It's normalized citations across all of these different fields. I want to actually see this all split up and broken apart, is what actually I want to see. I want to see this broken apart by these different demographic groups. That's what I would want to see. And the other thing is you're showing me a disparity. You're not showing me why. I don't disagree that there's a disparity from what you've done. I'm not sure I entirely agree that this method might be the most appropriate thing. I'd have to think on that more. But you're not showing me why. You're showing me a disparity. Again, I'm pointing this out to better understand and explain intersectional differences in citations. We explore the role of research topics for disciplines in humanities, social sciences, professional fields, and health. No STEM disciplines. No biology, anything like that. And yet, the whole conclusions of the article are all about all science. And again, this is another point to the point here. Distribution of topics by racial group and gender participation. Social sciences, humanities, professional fields, health. Social sciences, humanity, professional fields, health. In here. And basically what these are actually saying in here, and again, this will be linked for you. I encourage you to go read it if you can, and let me know if you have a problem. I will put it in locals for my locals members, my PDF copy of it, if you have a hard time finding it to read it. But this is racial group proportion. This is feminization, which is to say percentage likelihood that it is a woman that is doing the work. And the mean citation rate for each of these different things. So yeah, you can see certain things going on here, but mostly these are not hugely gigantic differences in color, and I question the significance of some of these differences with respect to certain things going on within the cloud of points here. Interesting. But again, all still focused on social sciences and health. Okay, this graphic I wanted to point out because this graphic is a prime example of a horrible graphic to read. I had to point it out because this graphic is absolutely abysmal in attempts to read it. Scholarly impact by topic in here. Over and under representation of groups by topic in social sciences and health. Again, social sciences and health. Recall, there was only one figure in this whole thing that focused anything on any other discipline kind of thing. And it's early on. And again, it shows a disparity. It doesn't show why. This shows a disparity. It doesn't show me why. The why has been assumed in this. It has never demonstrated why this is. It has never once demonstrated why this is. They're relying on others to demonstrate the reason why this is, for their extra large meta-analysis in which there could be many confounding factors. I'm merely pointing that out, that you have not demonstrated why. That is one of my biggest critiques of this article. You have not demonstrated why, not to mention you're doing an overgeneralization that this applies to all of science. Let's see. Yep. Oh, one thing I want to make a point on here. So one of the things they're arguing with this figure is that there's statistically significant difference between the average citation rate by race and gender, again, looking in here, for each of these things. And the reason they're arguing statistical significance is because the gray lines, the boundaries, the confidence intervals of a smoothing function that they've applied to their data points is not overlapping, which suggests a statistically significant difference. Problem is the way they're showing that significance is based upon very much here whether or not the confidence intervals of a smoother function overlap. What I want to point out, because it's really hard to read this, and this is again why I'm critiquing this article, and it's very hard to read. I'm going to zoom in close so you can see it in here. Let's see. They don't actually say here. Scholarly impact, overrepresentation, topics sorted by participation in the most cited group in each case. On the right margin, the figures show the number of citations by topic and low S smoothing, distribution of average topic citations by race and gender in social sciences and health. Topics are sorted by average number of citations, and smoothing function is drawn for each group using low S to model the evolution and the expected number of citations as the topics become more cited on average. The gray shadow in each model represents a 95% confidence interval, and therefore where the shadows do not overlap, the differences between groups are significant. Racial categories from each census, from the census corresponding to the AIAN and 2 or more are excluded from the racial inference for lack of data. I want to show you something. I'm going to zoom in close. Go over here just to show you the example. All of these individual data points in here are the actual citation rates in here associated with the different things of race and gender for all of their correspondents. Or at least that's what I think. They didn't actually say what it is in the caption that I just read. And I would also argue that they are arguing there is significant difference all the way throughout. I would argue that that's not entirely true because you do have numbers of things that definitely overlap quite significantly in specific groups of things. Particularly in very few different places up here. You do have some significant overlap in certain places, actually on both ends. On the very high citation rate, and on the very low citation rate. And I would point out this right here. Let's see. This color here is supposedly for, this color here is their lowest smooth for black men. And it overlaps nearly perfectly with a whole bunch of others. So this has to do with average citations by race and gender. And there's actually plenty of significant overlap right here in their smoothers. So I would actually argue, no, you actually do have very significant overlap. This is for the health part in particular here. Yeah, and so this is what, white women, Asian women, Latinx women, again, Hispanic women, because they don't really like that, Black women. This is a gender bias. Well, not a gender bias, a gender disparity, quite clearly there. But to say that there is perfectly significant difference with a lot of these things is wildly incorrect. And I suspect the reason is this data behind it, the dots that you can see in here, now when you zoom in close, is actually really highly variable, which does not surprise me in the slightest. Human research has a notorious problem with the fact that humans are wildly variable about different things as a group. It makes it very difficult to get significance about anything when you do human research. So pointing that out, this graphic is horrible, and they did not say actually what these dots are. And that is actually very disappointing that PNAS didn't call them on that. Somebody in the editor's office didn't call them on that. Anyway, let us continue. Our results demonstrate that macro-level differences in citation rates are observed at the intersection of race and gender, even when controlling for disciplines. No, actually didn't demonstrate that in the slightest. And that topic is related to author, race, and gender. Topic selection is rated to author, race, and gender. No, not necessarily. You're showing me a disparity exists. You are not showing me why a disparity exists. It stands to reason, therefore, that there might be a relationship between the populations engaged in certain topics and the citation density of the topics. No, not necessarily. And again, and I was going to say this because this happens a lot. The average number of citations of a topic is positively correlated with the presence of Asian and white men. Two things. Say it with me, folks. Correlation does not imply causation. Continue this again. That is a logical fallacy. And also, as I said earlier, you do have overlap, both on the low end and on the high end of one of your particular example here. That means there is not statistically significant difference for certain things. And also, you know what I'm complaining about with this? You didn't actually show me a significance test at all for any of these statistically significant difference. You're just assuming because of the 95% confidence interval there is. No, I want to see it with the data. I want to see you do it with the data. That's where I got a problem with the way this is being done here on top of it. No statistical significance test. Now for the conclusions, and I promise we're almost done. Inequalities in science have been studied for a century. Again, I wonder if inequalities and inequities are being used interchangeably. And several analyses have shown that these inequalities are the consequences of a non-meritocratic scientific system. Yeah, if it's an analysis like this one, I doubt it. Our results show that minoritized authors tend to publish in scientific disciplines and on research topics that reflect their gendered and racialized social identities. No, actually, for one thing, you didn't prove it. Again, I'm saying you're showing me a disparity. You're not showing me why that disparity exists in the slightest. There's an assumption made that the disparity is because of whatever race, sex, gender a person is. You've also made the broad generalization here that this is all of science. This study is not all of science. This is social sciences and health. Not all of science. The primary results in this study are social sciences and health. Why do I bring that up? Because people are going, often with studies, there is the veneer of authority that comes with peer review. It gets picked up and cited somewhere and used as the justification for something, and often without critically examining whether the study was done well, because it already has the veneer of peer review. And this is why as I'm getting older, I'm just like, no, we gotta be game and analyzing the studies ourselves and thinking about this, and this is part of the reason I'm doing this on this channel. These kinds of reviews is to show you what I'm thinking about as I'm reading a study, what kinds of questions I'm asking, all these other kinds of things so that you can go and do it. And you know what? The authors are always welcome to come back and answer my questions. I'd appreciate it. Go for it. Go for it. Answer my questions. I'm curious. But no, I don't think because of the way you've done this study in this particular article that your conclusions are justified for the entirety of science. Now, this paragraph is interesting. We found that differences in research impact can be at least partially explained by topic citation density, but that within topic differences remain. The compound effect of different citation rates of topics and unequal distribution of topics by race and gender leads to negative effects for marginalized groups and for science itself, as some topics become systematically less studied. The history of science is ripe with examples of understudied topics, such as female genitalia, which had direct implications on the life expectancy of women. Assuming constant productivity and considering the career age of authors, we can estimate the cumulative loss in particular topics over the last 40 years. Assuming that researchers with 20 years of publication activity produce 20 times that of incoming researchers, which is to say, well-established researchers produce more than early career researchers. If the author distribution over the last 40 years would have matched the 2010 U.S. Census, there would have been 29% more articles on public health, 26 more on gender-based violence, and 25% more on gynecology, and in gerontology, I do not know what that is, 20% more on immigrants and minorities, and 18% more on mental health. While this counterfactual scenario is coarse, it highlights the fact that a different body of knowledge would be produced in the absence of inequalities. And again, I think they're using inequalities and inequities interchangeably here. And that this body would more closely reflect the spectrum of topics relevant across society. The diversification of the scientific workforce is necessary to create a scientific system whose results benefit all of society. Okay. No, actually, you don't know that. You cannot honestly know that. And the reason you cannot honestly know that there would be X% more of this and X% more of that is because even if you had everything for the last 40 years match the 2010 census, you cannot guarantee that that's where they would end up. You cannot guarantee that that's what a person would end up researching or how that would go there. And that's for a couple of different reasons. What tends to be the most prominent is guided by the larger scientific body and by the needs of society. Yes, so you could get there, but at the same time, that's not necessarily true either. There are other factors aside from the things that they looked at here that influence whether a topic is highly cited or of interest to particular things in funding, which would again also push the citation rate. Funders look for different things. Those things get written up in papers and cited and what have you. Some topics are less popular than others. That doesn't make them any less meaningful or relevant. It also doesn't mean they get pushed as being important either. That is not a guarantee. This is an assumption that they are making that if the demographic was this way for the last 40 years, if the inequities, to use what I think they're using, in all of these things in the scientific disciplines of social sciences and health were removed, and there was more focus on this, that you would actually get to X% more of these things. You don't know that for sure. That is a looking back and presuming that things would have evolved differently in history. You cannot possibly know that. That's what I'm trying to get at with this. That's a, well, we could have had all this much stuff if we just did this. You don't know that. You cannot possibly know that. So that is I'm amazed that somebody didn't challenge them on that so that they could caveat that appropriately, because that's not true necessarily. You're making a very large guess at what could have been because of your thing of this. Well, if had society been this way based upon our analysis, it would have been this. But you don't actually know that. Yeah, you don't actually know that at all. Some things may very well say systematically less studied for other reasons, and it may very well be just because it's not important to society at large. It's because it's not the biggest thing in the scientific discipline at large until somebody comes up with a breakthrough that makes it worthy of study. And no, as many of you follow me on this channel know, I want to see very much diverse. I'm all for viewpoint diversity and getting very diverse perspectives and all sorts of backgrounds and everything into the sciences. But it's not necessarily true that one follows from the other. That if you had if you had everything be in the same demographics from the 2010 census, demographic representation be the same as the 2010 census in the scientific workforce of social sciences and health, that you would get all these things. That's not necessarily true. You can't know that without going back in time. Really, for sure. This paper has provided evidence of the relation between gender, research topic, and research impact and contributions, race, gender, research topic, and research impact and contributions to the wider dialogue on intersectional inequalities in science. I disagree. Well, I don't 100% disagree, because you're showing me that there's data there. And the analysis isn't necessarily bad. I'm not saying the analysis is bad. I have some questions about how it was done, and obviously I'm annoyed with the framing here. So yeah, and that's the primary thing, that I'm annoyed with the framing. You really didn't contribute all that much to intersectional inequalities in science. You're contributing to a strange discussion in the social sciences and health because of your narrow focus when you gave broad framing. Okay. Now, this is where we get back to woke logic, postmodernist logic. Discrimination defies notion of objective, apolitical, and meritocratic ideals in scientific discourse, a perception that serves to reinforce and mask race and gender biases in science. Structural racism remains a persistent source of mental and physical strain on minoritized groups in the United States, whose calls for justice across socioeconomic and professional domains are intermittently elevated in accordance with the ebbs and flows of American racial discourse. Academia is no different in this regard. The underrepresentation in science is similar to other sectors and may be attributed to the pervasive legacy of U.S. federal, state-sanctioned campaigns of systemic racialized exclusion aimed to reduce the representation and participation of minoritized race groups in all aspects of human life. So, you notice something in this article. They talked very much about disparities. And there were disparities shown, disparities discussed. This is the disparity fallacy, to quote the great Coleman Hughes, who put that out there, shown right here. Underrepresentation may be attributed to. Never anywhere in this article did they demonstrate that that's why they see these relationships. They have merely shown some data. They've never shown that that's why. They are saying may be attributed to the pervasive legacy. Always be wary of those kinds of things where you see these may be attributed to that, may be attributed to this, because it's not necessarily correct and could be based in a logical fallacy that any disparity is caused by discrimination. So I call this right here the disparity fallacy in action. It's a logical fallacy. That's what it is. And they did not demonstrate anything of why the disparities they see actually exist. They are presuming the reason why has to do with systemic discrimination. They never actually justified it anywhere. With their own analysis and logic, mind you. First, okay, now the final thing here, the recommendations. Our analysis suggests structural effects that reproduce systemic inequities. They're using inequities and inequalities interchangeably. It's crazy. In terms of value assigned to particular topics in both scientific evaluation and distribution of resources. Several policy recommendations emerge from this analysis. First, scientific institutions need to recognize the existence of knowledge gaps related with author, race, and gender segregation, and promote topics in which gendered and racialized minoritized authors are more present. Funding agencies can take immediate action to allocate increased funding in areas that have been historically underrepresented. Such funding will affect the entire academic reward system. Funding is strongly correlated with productivity and impact, both of which are associated with institutional advancement and rewards. This is why I mentioned the veneer of peer review issue. Because this study, which, again, is focused on social sciences and health, it just says absolutely almost nothing about broader science, and yet makes claims about broader science, is going to be picked up and used as justification for doing something. Which is exactly why I point this section out, in that they're saying, hey, funders, you should do this. This is highly concerning. This is not to say shouldn't go into funding under areas that are underworked on. We should actually fund those areas. I'm not against that. But I worry that this is going to be used in unpleasant ways that may well result in lawsuits in the United States. When I'm thinking about things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which says you cannot discriminate on the basis of race. Period. It's quite illegal. So there's the balance that's there. The other thing that they're not talking about here is, you've shown me some data about citation rates and the tendency to focus on different disciplines. Well, how do you get more people into those different subtopics and different disciplines that aren't typically in those fields? That's the other thing that they're not talking about here. But why not get people to move around more? And I also question, again, like I said, I've questioned the statistical significance of some of the results, because I don't think that just saying your confidence intervals do not overlap, therefore you have statistical significance, is appropriate. And they're particularly given the variability of the underlying data, as I zoomed in on figure 3 and showed you. But again, this is a one where I'm pretty much done here, but the final thoughts that I have are along this line. This is a study that was actually really narrow, focusing on social sciences and health, and yet made broad, sweeping conclusions about all of science, which I think is wholly inappropriate, given what they've done. They made assumptions left and right, with applying correlations of different things and what have you. Showing me a disparity does not show me why a disparity exists. You're merely reporting on it. They presume why in all these different things. They made a presumption about why. They didn't question why such things exist, which is a very harsh critique I have to make. And particularly with something as highly elevated as this is, with the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science publishing this. So I have to point that out. And it is not something I would consider using in terms of funding decisions necessarily, in terms of what to fund. At least, certainly not alone. In part because I don't think this study was very well done. My critiques of it. That's it. That's your Thursday review of a study. But again, like I said, my lesson for all of you in this is always check, if you get your hands on a study, check the methods of how a study was done against the conclusions that were drawn, the framing of it, and what have you. Because, like I said, this one makes sweeping conclusions that says all of science, and really all they focused on was social sciences and health. That's it for now. Let me know what you think. Come on over to Locals for the supporters only live chat here at 8 p.m. Central Time. That's it for now. Like the video, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good jazz. And until next time, until we meet again, I'm Adrian, and I hope you stay curious, my friends.